Hello and welcome back to Amplify. Today we are excited to speak with Marc Monseau. Marc is the president and founder of Mint Collective, a friend of White Knight Productions. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks. Very, very nice to be here, Elin.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled you're here. We have so many questions to ask you. And I would like to jump right in. I want to ask you all about video related questions. So all the statistics show us that people are turning to video for information. They do it because video helps to establish trust. Um, Videos help to establish credibility, many reasons that people use them. They can also help people recall information better later. So what are your thoughts on this rising popularity of videos?
Well, online video has been an important component in communicating health information really since the dawn of YouTube. Back in the day when I was still working at Johnson & Johnson millions and millions of years ago, my colleague, Rob Halper, recognized almost immediately once YouTube was launched the important role that video could play in communicating health information. And he ended up compiling and creating an entire YouTube channel for the company um, that included a huge repository of video content that was created by Dr. Nancy Snyderman, who had been formerly with a broadcast news organization. And since then, online video for healthcare information has just grown by leaps and bounds. A recent survey of the Digital Health Coalition examining healthcare leaders and healthcare advocates found that 81% of those individuals were turning online for health information in online video, primarily to be able to obtain information about tips and recommendations for managing disease, for finding information about new treatment options, for finding additional information about what people's lives are like when they're managing their medical conditions. The number of people who are turning to online video actually surpassed the number who are turning to other social media platforms for that level of information. And part of it is exactly what you were describing, Ellen, which is the idea that the content that's being created is real. It's authentic. It has this degree of trust and credibility about it that makes people confident in the kinds of information that's being shared through those platforms.
Yeah, it's such a different experience when you watch a video and a medical professional is giving you information almost face to face, obviously not really, but it has that feeling. It's very different receiving information like that than just trying to read it.
What I find is interesting too, and you mentioned healthcare professionals, but actually when you start to do sort of online analysis of conversations that are taking place around particular healthcare conditions, let's say multiple sclerosis or cystic fibrosis, or for that matter, diabetes, a lot of the people who are sharing that information through video aren't necessarily healthcare professionals. They're digital health advocates, patients, caregivers, other people within those communities, those disease state communities. They're creating their own content. And what's really interesting is when you start to probe deeply into the types of content that's being produced and the types of content that people that are watching, the content that has the most reach and resonance tends to be from patients. Who are sharing personal anecdotes, personal stories about what life is like living with a disease, what their own personal tips and recommendations are for other people in their community for better managing their disease, for information that they've managed to gather about new medical treatments, new scientific advances. Now, again, these aren't necessarily people who have a strong scientific background, but they're people who have personal experiences and tend to be people who delve deep and explore and develop deep understanding of that disease state, of the conditions that they're trying to manage. And they're sharing those personal stories, those stories of triumph, those stories of tragedy, the pain and the suffering that they have. And that's really what people are looking for. When people are looking for video, a lot of times about health information, they're looking for stories from people like themselves who are sharing their own personal experiences in managing that healthcare condition. People are turning to content that's being developed by others like themselves because they want to feel that they are not alone in dealing with what they're having to deal with. And by going and finding that content, they feel in some way that they are part of a community that's experiencing many of the same things. And so there's this degree of trust and this degree of confidence in what's being created.
Yeah, I love that. There's a connection, an emotional connection that video allows you to make in a way that you cannot get with a written word. As much as I love books, I see all those books behind you. It's not the same. And there is that, as you were speaking, I kept thinking of the word authenticity.
Yes.
There is that, there's something about hearing those stories that make people just hungry for more, especially if they're facing a similar predicament. So yeah, those were great examples.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we find, and that creates challenges and opportunities for marketers and for people in the communications industry. Um, One of the challenges that we face is that in and as someone who saw kind of the origins of online video production for health information, health content, to kind of where we've sort of arrived now, one of the big transitions that occurred was that shift from creating very kind of formal, rigid video type content by brands and businesses. And one of the things that we find is that those talking head videos that, and you know what I'm talking about, Ellen, where you just have this very, very confident, very well scripted healthcare professional who's sharing some information that just doesn't necessarily resonate, and it doesn't necessarily um, get the views or get the spread that you really are looking for. And so one of the big challenges that marketers and health and communications professionals have had to deal with today is trying to create content that will be viewed and will be perceived as being authentic and being real. And that creates both opportunities and challenges for marketers and communications professionals as they're pulling together that type of content. One of the things that we found that creates a way for us to get there is to turn to those very same people that I was describing earlier, those patient digital online influencers, and bring them into the fold and help them create content for the business, for the brand. Maybe not necessarily branded communications, but communications in which they're putting together content that feels real, that provides you with the credibility and the authenticity that that digital health influencer has, and bringing them in as part of the program that you're putting together. And some examples of the types of content that can be produced include things like tips and recommendations for managing your healthcare condition. Maybe not necessarily medically proven techniques, but tips and counsel. For instance, we did a project recently with members of the MS community where we found that people out of the community were really looking for life hacks, tips and recommendations about how to navigate a house while struggling with multiple sclerosis, for instance, how to make spaghetti when it's very difficult to lift up that pan of boiling water. And the opportunity for a business would be to create content leveraging one of those online influencers to provide that level of non-medical tips and counsel for living with the disease. Another area where there's an opportunity to bring in one of those digital health influencers is really on, even using them to provide their perspectives on what life is like um, in the current kind of treatment regimen that exists today. So, for instance, for a company I was working with recently that was focused in the cystic fibrosis community, they created a series of beautiful videos, sort of examining what patients' lives are like today compared to what their lives were like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, sort of demonstrating the value of the development of new scientifically proven treatments and new treatment regimens. And having those stories be told by people in the community is powerful. People want to see that. And it really helps to kind of reinforce the value of the business and value of the brand in that sense.
Yeah, so like what I'm hearing you say is that when marketers are pulling together their content, when they're brainstorming their content and creating a content plan or content calendar, it really pays dividends to put yourself in the shoes of the patient, of the patient's family, friends, allies.
Well, yeah, and you've hit the nail right on the head. It's not just a matter of coming out and saying, "Look, I've got this great idea for creating this type of content." It's really going back to marketing basics, which is to understand the audiences you're trying to reach, to understand what is going to motivate them, what is going to inspire them, and what kind of content is going to resonate. And that means really doing your research, right? Having informal gatherings with people in the community to kind of understand what they need, to even do kind of broad environmental assessments to understand what kind of content's currently being created and what kind of content is getting traction. And that's one of the more interesting things to do, is to do one of those deep dives to really sort of understand where things are. So it's not just a matter of just launching out and creating something. It's really understanding your community that you're trying to reach, understanding their needs, understanding the gaps in the marketplace, and then to start to create content around that.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up that human connection and that humanness, because as much as AI develops and can bring us value in the healthcare industry, it comes back down to the person and the human that you're trying to communicate with. So it's a wonderful reminder. And you said to marketing 101. So I want to ask you about conversions. And videos are a fantastic tool to drive conversions. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how businesses can leverage that popularity of video to really resonate with their audience. Do you have any tips to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about best in class, the best type of videos that it can be produced, particularly in the healthcare space. One of the key things is always to have some kind of call to action if you can, and it gets a little more complicated when you're talking about content that is really being geared around disease awareness. So, for instance, the kinds of content, and we did some video production on this in this category, where you're creating content with individuals who are really trying to raise awareness of a particular condition, to provide basic understanding of what that disease is like. There, that call to action is a little more complicated. However, there is this opportunity to try to encourage people, to drive them back to discover additional content. And one of the things that I think we've talked about before is the importance of, when you're putting together a piece of content like a video, you're investing a lot of time, you're investing a lot of energy in putting in that together, you're investing a lot of resources in pulling that together, is to treat it as if it is a campaign. When you create that content, that it doesn't live in isolation. It doesn't just simply go up on online, living on YouTube or on your website, but that you actually create additional pieces of content around it. You create a blog. You create other smaller form video pieces that can be distributed through social media sites. You create, you make sure you put paid advertising behind it. You look for partnerships to help with distribution. You leverage that online influencer that I keep talking about to see whether they can distribute it through their own channels as well. And you also make sure that what's being created might live within an online platform that includes additional pieces of content that helps to create more equity and image building for your brand in that space as well. So it's just not one and done. It's just not one piece of content that goes out and then disappears, that you create an entire ecosystem around it that supports that piece of content.
What you just said really resonates with my belief and what we always advocate for with White Knight, that our clients utilize that content to the max, really think about it and figure out what else they can squeeze out of it and how to be very strategic about that content. Because that one and done video model, it's an expensive model and not the most effective in many cases.
Well, and we've done that with work that we've done with you, where we've created not just that one long form video, but we've created multiple pieces of smaller bits of content that gets distributed in different ways. And we even leverage those video files to create audiograms that could then be distributed as well, little audio files that could be distributed. And that to me is really what you should be aiming for. That when you're creating that content, you're leveraging that influence, you're leveraging that subject matter expertise, and you're bringing them in, and you're making sure that you're taking that and using it as many ways as you possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. And with our experts being so busy these days, and our subject matter experts or our subjects of the videos, whether they be the patients or whoever, everybody's busy. And so it allows us as the video producers to be very efficient and respectful of the time of those people and to get a lot of content. So I love that model. I'm going to give you a topic and just give me some best practices, some kind of like bullet points if I wanted to make this kind of video. Okay, first one, disease awareness.
Yeah, this is a great one, Ellen, and there's so many opportunities for creating great disease awareness content. I think when you're creating that, you want to make sure, again, there's a great opportunity to bring in the both subject matter experts from the scientific and medical community, as well as patients and caregivers, people who are living and breathing that disease at the time. We've been involved with a couple of really interesting places where we've really tried to raise awareness of specific conditions, specific diseases. In one case, we actually we were trying to break into a very noisy category around acne and different skin treatments, and we tried it multiple ways. We ended up bringing in those subject matter experts from the scientific and medical community who could provide little factoids about what this condition, what acne was like, different ways to treat it, and so forth. But one of the things that we did that we had a lot of fun with was actually physically going and setting up a man on the street interviews where we interviewed young adults about what they did to better manage their acne and different skin conditions. And it was one of these series of videos where you were having content that was coming from real people who were sharing real insights and the real angst and pain around managing that condition as well. And so to me, when we're talking about disease awareness, you want something that is going to resonate with those audiences and that is going to ring true to those audiences so that people could put themselves into the mindset of those people who are dealing with that medical condition as well. And that to me is a great way to create good disease awareness content, particularly where there's a condition that may have some stigma associated with it, is really bring in individuals, people who are trusted, people who are considered credible in that space who can create that content. And to me, really where it works extremely well is not necessarily the people who are at the celebrity level, but people who are really living it in a daily life. And I keep thinking about the man on the street interviews that we did around acne, which were so much fun. And again, creating content with people who were really dealing with this on a daily basis.
No, that sounds wonderful. I'd love to see that. It sounds like a brilliant use of that technique. Love that. What about like crisis communications? What about when companies are preparing for when things don't go so well? How can video be a support there?
Well, I come from for many years I worked at Johnson & Johnson in their corporate communications function, and my role there was around issues management and crisis comms generally. I was the guy who would pick up the phone when the Wall Street Journal would call asking questions about a product recall or whatever it might be. And so I had a lot of experience in that area, and certainly video is a great opportunity to be able to really get your story out there in a concise, in a thoughtful, and in a meaningful way. One of the kind of best practices, certainly from a corporate comms perspective, and again, it differs from case to case, but certainly making sure that you have individuals within your organization who you can turn to in that time of crisis, who can really help to convey your story. That means media training them ahead of time. That means making sure you've got a stable of people who you can bring forward who will be able to speak with a degree of authority and a degree of credibility. Generally, when we're talking about a healthcare specific crisis, you're talking about somebody who is who is medically trained, ideally somebody who will people will empathize with, somebody who has a family or is able to explain things in a way that is compassionate and is meaningful. And so you end up wanting to create a whole group of people who you can bring forward to provide that level of perspective as and when it needs to occur. Some of the worst sort of corporate crises that have occurred over the last decade or so have been exacerbated when companies have not brought forward somebody to really provide their perspective on a particular case. And you can turn to a number of examples over the past couple of years where companies have failed to put that face forward and instead kind of resorted to very stiff statements or written responses rather than providing that human face through the perspective of an individual.
Okay, let's talk now about the campaign approach. So, video is important and it should play a role in your strategy, but it shouldn't necessarily be the only way you're communicating with your audience. So, why is it important to have this more holistic campaign view when trying to communicate with your audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it comes down to the idea that you're distributing content in a very crowded space, and so you want to make sure that if you're putting the time, the money, the resources into the developing that video content, you want to make sure that it gets visibility and it gets play in that degree, and you also, for it to sort of sit in isolation doesn't necessarily make it authentic in a way that it becomes a one and done, one off piece of content. Ideally, what you want to be able to create is the video should be able to complement kind of broader initiatives that you're putting together as part of your organization or your brand. That means making sure that the video content that you're creating fits into your strategic plan and is part of a broader strategic approach to be able to get to drive the change or drive the results that you're looking for. Video should be, if you're kind of making video the centerpiece of what you're trying to do, it should be complemented by written content, whether it's through kind of a long form blog or website content. You should be creating multiple pieces of video content that can be distributed through multiple online channels. You should be creating social content to help to support it and promote it. You should be putting paid advertising behind it to make sure that it's getting the visibility of the audiences that you're trying to reach. You should ensure that you're putting potentially creating partnerships with other distribution organizations. Perhaps explore native advertising as a means to make sure that video content, if you're putting all that energy into creating it, that it has a vehicle to get to the right audiences at the right time in the places that they're looking for that content. There could be opportunities to leverage earned media, where you reach out to others in that space, particularly if you're dealing with online influencers, to help them distribute that content to get the word out. That's particularly important for disease awareness initiatives. That's particularly important for initiatives that are tackling major issues that may be emerging as well. So really, to be able to be successful in this space, it isn't enough just to create content and distribute it. It's making sure that it's part of a broader campaign approach where you're sort of reaching and driving people to that content in different ways.
Yes, and everything is complementing and supplementing and driving that message home. So I think a lot of people don't recognize that or don't realize that. They simplify the process of video marketing down too far to the point where it can't be effective on its own. A video on its own is powerful, but it can be so much more. It's not realize its full potential oftentimes if it's not supported with these other elements.
I think you put it so well right there, because that is exactly it. It really can't be all that it can be without all these other elements around it.
So you have been in this industry for a long time, as we were talking about, and over the course of your career, you've worked on many video projects. So are there some general do's and don'ts you can share about specifically making videos in the healthcare industry? What are a few best practices?
Again, I'm a journalist by training, so I always think about things in terms of the story and how you tell the story. And with that in mind, the very first thing that I always try to bear in mind is that you really need to capture attention up front. You need to treat this as if you're really writing or putting together a story that is going to be distributed in a news fashion. You want to have that grabber up front, whether that's a a challenge question that's being raised, whether that's an issue that needs to be overcome, whether it's a personal tragedy that needs to be kind of dealt with, whether it's something that's going to grab their attention. You need that up front to really drive it. So that's the very first thing. The second thing, and this is something we found over the course of the last decade or so, is that you got to keep it short. Don't need to tell you this, Ellen, but again, people need to bear in mind that the attention span just keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter all the time. Once upon a time, a 5-minute video was acceptable. I think now it's more like 2. The reality is that people are looking for something even shorter and tighter than that. And so that means that you have to be very succinct with how you tell your story and figure out how to really condense it down. The next thing is to make sure you keep it real. That means putting in real people in real situations and keep them unscripted as best as possible. That's hard in the healthcare industry, particularly where you're dealing with a very highly regulated industry and everything needs to go through copy approval. When you're dealing with content that is going to go through very rigorous copy approval measures, one tip that I have for your readers is to make sure that you work with your copy approval committees before you actually go and sit down in front of the camera and you agree on certain message points that are going to be conveyed. Be able to share those with the people that are creating the content and allow them to kind of work within that framework, but try as much as you can to avoid scripting, because scripting kills and makes it feel very stagnant and stilted. Again, use real people as much as possible, whether it's kind of online influencers who are healthcare professionals, whether it's online influencers who are patients, or whether it's just individuals who may have an experience in that space and may not have a degree of authority, but are people who are actually dealing with that disease. But keep it real and tell the story as best you can with those people themselves. Make sure that the people tell the stories, use multiple voices whenever possible, and make sure that story is being told not through a disembodied narrator's voice, but through real human beings. Make sure everything's viewable with sound off so that people can share that content. And then use a call to action whenever you can. Again, it becomes more complicated with some content, but you want to drive people to take some action, whether it's to follow your page, whether it's to find more pieces of content, or whether it's to sort of activate them to share that with others who may be experiencing something the same. So those are the top line things that I kind of bring forward. And I think in talking those through, you also can see some things that you don't want to do, right? So you don't want to necessarily have that scripted conversation. You don't want to have that talking head medical professional framed up. You want to tell that story in multiple voices as best you can.
Thank you so much, Marc. It has been a true pleasure speaking with you today, and I would love to have you back here at Amplify sometime in the future.
Well, thank you. It's been a delight being on this, and it's been great working with you guys over the course of the last year, and I've really enjoyed that. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today.